Whenever I sit down to draw a portrait, I notice something about myself. I can easily spend 3, sometimes even 4 hours on a single piece, and it's not because the drawing demands that much time. It's more because I fall into the habit of endlessly rendering little details that don't actually matter in the bigger picture. I'll obsess over strands of hair, folds in clothing, or tiny textures that don't really change how the portrait feels. That realization started to bother me a little, because while I love taking my time and polishing every corner of the drawing, sometimes it feels like I'm pouring energy into details that don't add much. And in a way, that habit can distract me from focusing on the parts that really do matter, the essence of the portrait. So in today's video, I, Ryuguku, decided to give myself a challenge, an experiment. I set a very clear rule for myself. This drawing would have a strict time limit, 2 hours maximum, not a minute longer. Now usually my workflow is pretty methodical. I start with a loose sketch using Willow charcoal to block in shapes. Then I build the shadows with charcoal powder, which I apply using a blending stump. And finally, I refine and sharpen everything with my charcoal pencil, adding more and more detail until I feel satisfied. And because there's no real time constraint, I can go on like that for hours, polishing and polishing. But for this piece, I wanted to break that pattern. The new rule was simple, 2 hours only. That meant I had to think differently. I couldn't afford to sink time into areas that weren't important. I had to choose what really mattered and let go of the rest. This felt like both a restriction and an opportunity. A restriction because I knew I would feel rushed, but also an opportunity because maybe, just maybe, this would help me focus more sharply on the most important parts of the portrait instead of drowning in details. The moment I actually started the drawing with that 2-hour timer in mind, I immediately felt different. There was this subtle pressure, like a clock was ticking in the back of my head. Normally, I can drift into the drawing without worrying about time, but here I knew I had to move with purpose, and honestly, at first, it felt a little uncomfortable. To calm myself down, I gave myself a safety net. I told myself, if this experiment doesn't work, if the drawing looks unfinished or not presentable, I can always allow myself to continue later. That's okay. Giving myself that permission made me feel a little freer, like I wasn't gambling the whole drawing on this one rule. But still, I knew if I wanted to stick to the experiment, I needed to make choices differently than usual. And that started right away with what to simplify. The clothing, for example. Normally, I would spend so much time rendering everything, but this time I forced myself to resist. I blocked in mostly just the shoulder part, and the rest I don't really care. No overthinking. The same with the hair. Usually I can sink half an hour just on strands, layering values, making it silky and controlled. But under time pressure, I knew I couldn't afford that. Instead, I tried to keep the hair as shapes of light and dark without obsessing over every strand. The interesting part was when I came to the eyes. At the beginning, I even tried to simplify them a little, just to stay on track. And that surprised me, because instead of losing something, I felt like the eyes actually worked better. They were sharper, more direct, without being over-polished. This was the first turning point for me. I started to realize that simplification wasn't just a compromise. It could actually make the drawing stronger in some ways. Less noise, more focus. As I kept moving forward, something interesting happened. I realized that my actual workflow didn't really change. I still started with Willow charcoal, layered powder with my blending stump, and refined forms with pencil. The steps were the same, but the way I approached each stage felt different. Instead of treating every area as something that had to be resolved to perfection, I had to constantly ask myself, is this worth spending more time on, or should I move on? That question kept echoing in my head, and honestly, it wasn't easy. I had to fight against my own habits. There's this strong urge in me to polish every section, to smooth every transition until it feels right. And under the time limit, that urge kept pulling at me. It was like a little voice saying, fix this, adjust that. You can't leave it like this. But then another voice inside me pushed back. No, leave it. Keep going. It doesn't need to be perfect. That back and forth was probably the hardest part of the experiment. Not the actual drawing, but the mindset. The fear of leaving things imperfect. The discomfort of moving on when I felt like there was more to be done. I worried a lot in those moments. I worried that by simplifying, I was losing accuracy. I worried that the drawing would look unfinished or sloppy. But instead of giving in to that worry, I tried to let it go. I reminded myself, the rule isn't about making a perfect drawing. The rule is about testing a different way of working. If this fails, it fails, and that's still valuable. So I practiced letting go. I left clothing abstract. I resisted blending areas smooth. I accepted little irregularities instead of erasing and reworking them. And the more I did that, the more I realized imperfections aren't always mistakes. Sometimes they add energy. Sometimes they make the drawing feel alive instead of frozen in perfection. That was the real shift happening inside me. I wasn't just drawing faster. I was drawing with a different mindset. A mindset that valued movement and focus over endless polishing. When I finally stepped back after those 2 hours, I wasn't completely sure how I felt. On one hand, I was relieved that I had stuck to the limit. On the other, part of me still wondered, does this look unfinished? Did I leave too much behind? So instead of judging it right away, I decided to let the drawing sit overnight. I put it aside and let my eyes and my brain rest from it. And the next day, when I came back to look at it fresh, something clicked. It actually looked fine, more than fine even. It looked complete. None of the areas I had simplified felt wrong or distracting. The clothing, even though I left out a big portion of it, still reads clearly as clothing. The hair, which I had treated as simple, light and dark shapes, still had flow and form, and those little imperfections that I had worried about, they didn't stand out at all. The portrait at this point feels complete. That realization felt powerful. By simplifying, I hadn't weakened the drawing at all. The focus was clearer. The balance between refined and loose areas made the drawing feel more dynamic, more alive. Sure, if I had added 1 more hour, I probably could have made it smoother, more polished, maybe closer to the reference. But looking at it with fresh eyes, I realized I didn't need to. The drawing was already working, and more hours wouldn't necessarily make it better, just more polished. And that's when it hit me. Sometimes less really is more. Looking back, I realized this little experiment wasn't just about saving time. It was about breaking my own habits, my own routines, and giving myself space to see things differently. By putting a 2-hour limit on myself, I was forced to focus on what mattered most. And in doing that, I discovered new possibilities in my process. That's the real value of limitation. It pushes you to adapt, to be more efficient, to prioritize. Instead of pouring endless energy into details that don't matter, you're challenged to step back and ask, what's really important here? And that's not just about drawing, that's about growth. I think sometimes, as artists, we can get trapped in the idea of perfection. We want every detail polished, every edge smooth, every mark intentional. But the truth is, most people who see our work don't compare it to the reference pixel by pixel. They don't notice the little imperfections we obsess over. What they feel is the whole picture, the overall impact, the mood, the focus, and what makes the portrait feel alive. That's why I want to encourage anyone listening. Don't be afraid to try your own experiments. Maybe it's setting a time limit. Maybe it's limiting your tools or changing your process in some way. It's uncomfortable, yes, but that discomfort is what leads to growth. You learn things about yourself and your art that you wouldn't discover if you always stay in your comfort zone. For me, this 2-hour drawing felt like a step forward. It showed me that I don't always need to work longer to make something complete. Sometimes less time, less detail, and fewer corrections can actually bring out more life in the drawing. And because of that, I definitely want to try this again. Maybe I'll set different limits next time or try restricting my tools. The point isn't the rule itself. The point is to challenge myself to see things differently. At the end of the day, that's what art is about. Not just repeating what we know, but constantly experimenting, evolving, and finding new ways to connect with what we create. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to see the real-time video along with the reference photo, you can check it out on my Patreon. This one was more of an experiment. There is no voiceover throughout the drawing process, but if you want to follow along, watching the real-time drawing will make it much easier.